The formation is accelerating. They're approaching the rendezvous.
I see it. Divert power to forward shields.
Shields at maximum.
All hands, prepare for warp speed.
Aye, Captain. Course laid in. Engage.
The Dominion War did not pause for miracles. 14 Jem'Hadar attack ships carved through the debris field at coordinates 331 Mark 7, 3 light minutes from the Bajoran wormhole's event horizon. They moved in the tight, aggressive formation that Starfleet tactical officers had learned to dread, no wasted motion, no hesitation, pure biological certainty translated into military geometry. The Federation convoy they were hunting consisted of 2 battered Excelsior-class vessels and a Vulcan medical transport, all running at reduced warp after a skirmish near Bataste. They were slow. They were damaged. They were exactly the kind of prey the Jem'Hadar preferred. Commander Jadzia Dax had been tracking the engagement from Deep Space Nine's Ops Center for 11 minutes, her jaw tight, her fingers moving across the console with the practiced economy of someone who had fought in 8 lifetimes worth of wars. The convoy couldn't reach the station's defensive perimeter in time. The math was ugly and she had already run it 4 times. 3 minutes before they're in weapons range of the convoy, she said. We have to move now. Captain Benjamin Sisko stood at the center of ops, hands clasped behind his back, the posture of a man who had learned to make catastrophic decisions look calm. Prep the Defiant. Get Kira and O'Brien. The wormhole opened. Not in the way it usually opened, that elegant, blooming spiral of blue-white light that the Bajorans had spent decades calling the Celestial Temple. This was something different. Something wrong. The aperture tore rather than blossomed, edges jagged and crackling with energy signatures that the computer couldn't immediately classify. A sound came through the station's hull sensors, not a sound exactly, but a vibration, a frequency that landed somewhere between a thunderclap and a scream. What was that? Kira said from the tactical console. Unknown energy discharge, Dax answered, her voice carrying the particular controlled tension of someone actively refusing to sound alarmed. Dimensional variance in the rift signature. This didn't come from the wormhole, something punched through from an adjacent. The ship came through. It was enormous. Not Borg enormous, not in the way that made the stomach drop and the lizard brain start screaming about extinction events, but big. Easily 400 meters. Its hull design was unlike anything in Starfleet's recognition database, smooth, almost aerodynamic in a way that suggested whoever built it didn't entirely understand that space didn't have wind, with twin-engine pods and a primary hull that bore a passing, disorienting resemblance to a Federation vessel if a Federation vessel had been designed by someone working from a description rather than a blueprint. Along its hull, in large, confident lettering, NSEA Protector. It tumbled out of the rift at fractional impulse, clearly not under full navigational control, spinning slowly on its axis before whoever was at the helm, if anyone was at the helm, managed to arrest the rotation. It came to a shuddering stop directly between the Jem'Hadar formation and the wounded convoy. The Jem'Hadar stopped. In 11 months of war, Dax had never seen a Jem'Hadar formation simply stop. They didn't stop. Stopping implied uncertainty, and the Jem'Hadar had been genetically engineered to be a great many terrible things, but uncertain was not among them. Yet here they were, 14 attack ships hanging in space, their weapons hot and their targeting scanners presumably going insane trying to classify what they were looking at. Hailing frequencies, Sisko said. No response from the unknown vessel. Dax looked up from her console. Benjamin, their power readings are extraordinary. Whatever that drive system is, it's putting out energy on par with a galaxy class at maximum warp. But the configuration is completely alien. Alien how? Alien like nothing we've ever encountered. The hull metallurgy, the energy signatures, the dimensional rift they came through, none of it matches any known species or technology. She paused. And they're broadcasting. On what frequency? All of them. Dax allowed herself a small, baffled expression. Every subspace channel simultaneously. Audio only. It's Benjamin, it's someone screaming. Through the speakers, patched in from the communications array, came a voice. Male. Loud. Carrying the particular quality of a man who was accustomed to projecting to the back of a very large room. Activate the forward cannons. Tommy, hard to starboard. Whoever is on weapons, someone get on weapons. Gwen, what does that button? A different voice, female, with the strained patience of someone who had explained the same thing many times. That's not a button, Jason, that's a status display, and if you keep hitting it you're going to vent the forward compartment into. A third voice, British, deeply aggrieved, I am a classically trained Shakespearean actor. I went to RADA. I performed Hamlet at the National Theatre. I am not qualified to operate a particle cannon. The Jem'Hadar opened fire on the convoy. What happened next occurred in approximately 4 seconds, and would be replayed in Starfleet tactical briefings for the next 6 months. The NSEA Protector, still broadcasting its audio chaos, swung its primary hull between the Jem'Hadar salvo and the lead Excelsior-class vessel. The energy bolts hit the Protector's shields. The shields held, not strained, not flickered, held, absorbing a concentrated Jem'Hadar strike that would have gutted a Starfleet vessel. Then the Protector's forward weapons array fired. One shot. The lead Jem'Hadar attack ship ceased to exist in any meaningful structural sense. The remaining 13 ships pulled back to a distance of 40,000 kilometers and stopped again. In Deep Space Nine's Ops Center, nobody spoke for approximately 3 seconds. Tractor beam, Sisko said finally. Bring them in. The docking bay doors had seen a great deal in the past 3 years. They had received runabouts limping back from Dominion ambushes with hull breaches and wounded crew. They had accepted Klingon birds of prey trailing plasma from damaged nacelles. Once, memorably, they had taken in what remained of a Cardassian Gaylor-class vessel after its crew had defected and its pursuing escort had made a sincere effort to prevent that defection. Chief Miles O'Brien had personally overseen repairs on all of it, and he had developed the specific emotional resilience of a man who had learned that the universe would always find new ways to surprise him. He was revising that assessment now. The NSEA Protector sat in the main docking bay like something out of a fever dream, its hull filling the space with an almost aggressive confidence, landing struts deployed with a hydraulic precision that suggested the ship knew exactly what it was doing even if its crew clearly did not. The vessel's design kept snagging O'Brien's attention in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Something familiar in the lines of it, something that reminded him of home in a way that made no rational sense given that he had never seen this ship in his life. He was still puzzling over it when the forward airlock cycled open. 6 people came down the boarding ramp. The first thing O'Brien noticed was the uniforms. They were wearing what appeared to be Starfleet-adjacent jumpsuits. Not Starfleet, not quite, the division colors were wrong and the insignia didn't match any branch he recognized, but the general aesthetic was close enough that his brain kept trying to file them under crew before his eyes corrected the error. The second thing he noticed was that none of them walked like Starfleet officers. One of them was walking like a man who had just realized a long-running bluff was about to be called. One of them was walking like she was furious and managing it with extreme professionalism. One of them, tall, angular, with prosthetic facial ridges that were either a very good makeup job or the most understated alien physiology O'Brien had ever encountered, was walking like a man attending his own execution. The others were various gradations of terrified. Except one. A heavy-set man near the back of the group was looking around the docking bay with an expression of absolute childlike wonder, turning slowly on his heel to take in the runabouts, the equipment bays, the curvature of the station's interior, as though he was seeing something magnificent rather than a military installation in a war zone. Security Chief Odo was already there, flanked by 2 deputies, his expression carrying its usual quality of barely contained suspicion. He looked at the 6 arrivals the way he looked at everything, as a problem that hadn't fully revealed its nature yet. I'll need all of you to state your names, your vessel's registry, your point of origin, and your intention in Federation space, Odo said. It was not a request. The man in front, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with the jawline of someone who had spent considerable time ensuring people noticed his jawline, stepped forward and smiled. It was an extraordinary smile. It was the smile of a man who had absolute confidence that smiling would solve the situation. Commander Peter Quincy Taggart, he said. NSEA Protector. We come in peace. Odo stared at him. That's not my real name, the man added, the smile flickering slightly. My actual name is Jason Nesmith. The ship's name is real, though. The ship is very real. The ship is, in fact, the thing I'd most like to talk about because I want to be upfront that we did not entirely intend to be here and several of the controls are not. Jason. The woman. Blonde, precise, with the quality of someone who had been managing a situation longer than was reasonable, put a hand on his arm. Let me. She turned to Odo with the expression of a person who had decided that honesty, deployed correctly, was the only viable remaining strategy. My name is Gwen DeMarco. This is going to sound unusual. Everything about this situation is unusual, Odo said. Continue. We're actors. She said it cleanly, without apology. We were cast in a science fiction television program approximately 8 years ago. The program was called Galaxy Quest. It was about a spaceship crew. The ship was called the NSEA Protector. She gestured behind her at the vessel filling the docking bay. Aliens watched our show. They believed it was real. They built us a ship based on it. There have been some adventures since then. The ship is genuine. The technology is genuine. We, however, are not Starfleet officers, we are not military personnel, and until approximately 40 minutes ago we were attending a fan convention in Burbank, California. The docking bay was very quiet. O'Brien realized his mouth was open and closed it. Odo turned to look at him with an expression that said, very clearly, you are the engineer, tell me this is not what it sounds like. O'Brien looked at the ship. He looked at the people. He looked back at the ship. The familiar lines of it tugged at his memory again, and suddenly, with the particular lurch of a man who has been staring at an optical illusion until it resolves, he understood why it looked familiar. It looked like someone had watched every episode of a science fiction program and then built the ship with total sincerity and enormous resources and no actual engineering training. I'm going to need to get inside that vessel, O'Brien said. Please don't touch the Omega-13, Jason Nesmith said immediately. We're still not entirely sure what it does. From the back of the group, the heavy-set man, Fred, someone had called him Fred, was smiling at a runabout with the deep, uncomplicated appreciation of a man who found everything wonderful. He turned to the nearest security deputy and said, in a tone of genuine curiosity, is that a matter-energy converter? The deputy looked at the runabout. That's yes, technically, the transporter. Fred said warmly, as though this confirmed something he had long suspected. Captain Sisko arrived 90 seconds later, took one look at the 6 people standing in his docking bay, and said, my office. All of you. Sisko's office had hosted Klingon generals, Romulan senators, and a founder who had worn the face of a Starfleet admiral for the better part of a year. It had never hosted this. Jason Nesmith sat across the desk from Benjamin Sisko with the posture of a man who was performing confidence so hard he had briefly forgotten it was a performance. Gwen DeMarco sat beside him with her hands folded and her expression carefully neutral. Alexander Dane had taken the chair furthest from the door and was studying the Bajoran artifacts on the shelf behind Sisko's head with the focused attention of a man who was using cultural anthropology to avoid making eye contact with anyone. Tommy Weber was in the corner, young, coiled with nervous energy, his fingers moving unconsciously against his thigh in small precise patterns that Kira recognized, after a moment, as someone running through piloting muscle memory. Fred Kwan sat placidly in the remaining chair, radiating the specific serenity of a man who had made his peace with the universe at some point and never felt the need to revisit the decision. Guy Fleegman stood near the back wall because there were no more chairs, and had been slowly edging toward the door for the past 4 minutes in a way he clearly believed was undetectable. Kira was watching him do it. Odo stood to one side with a pad, taking notes with the methodical precision of a man building a case. Sisko looked at the 6 of them for a long moment. Then he looked at Dax, who was standing beside him with her arms crossed and the expression she wore when something had genuinely surprised her, which was rare enough to be its own kind of alarm signal. "Let me make sure I understand the situation correctly," Sisko said. His voice was the voice he used in negotiations, measured, attentive, carrying the suggestion that he was giving the other party every possible benefit of the doubt while simultaneously cataloging every inconsistency. "You are human. All 6 of you. From Earth." "Yes," Jason said. 21st century Earth. Early 21st, yes. Give or take. "You were cast in a television program that depicted a fictional starship crew." "Correct. Extraterrestrial beings, the Thermians, intercepted the broadcast of this program, interpreted it as a historical document rather than fiction, and constructed a fully functional starship based on its production design." A brief pause around the room. Jason nodded. Yes. That's the summary. "And you subsequently used this ship, built by aliens who believed you were real Starfleet officers, to defeat an actual alien warlord." "Sarris," Gwen said. "His name was Sarris. We defeated him twice, technically." "Twice," Sisko repeated. "The Omega-13 was involved in the second instance. Time was, briefly reorganized." Sisko was quiet for a moment. Kira watched him absorb this with the same expression he had used when the prophets had first spoken directly to him. Not disbelief exactly, but the careful recalibration of a man updating his model of what the universe was willing to do. "The Omega-13, he said. "That's what brought you here." "We were in our home system," Jason said, and for the first time the performance slipped slightly, something real showing through the confidence, something that looked like guilt. "Sarris had a brother, apparently. Or an heir. Someone with a grudge and a fleet. We activated the Omega-13 to reverse there was a collision, the forward section was," he stopped. "Reorganized. We activated it and woke up next to your wormhole. In the middle of a Dominion attack formation," Kira said. "We didn't know it was the middle of anything. We were just trying not to be dead. You destroyed a Jem'Hadar attack ship." Jason looked at Tommy. Tommy looked at his hands. "The weapons system on the Protector it's very responsive. I may have miscalibrated the yield." O'Brien's voice came through Sisko's combadge before anyone could respond to that. O'Brien to Sisko. "Captain, I need you to come down to the docking bay." "Report, Chief." "I'd rather show you, sir. I've been going through the Protector's engineering specs with Fred, is it? Fred has been helping me understand the drive system." A pause in which O'Brien's voice carried the specific quality of a man who had just discovered something that violated his professional understanding of what was possible. "Captain, the Thermians built this ship using quantum molecular fabrication technology that we don't have a theoretical framework for. The reactor output is approximately 4 times what our best ships can generate. The shields are," another pause. "Sir, that single Jem'Hadar volley that hit them when they first came through should have cored the ship. Their shields absorbed it like it was a stern look." Sisko looked at Jason. Jason spread his hands in a gesture that managed to be simultaneously apologetic and proud. "The Thermians," Alexander Dane said from the corner, speaking for the first time since entering the office. His voice was deep, precise, carrying the residual authority of a man who had spent decades projecting to theater audiences. Everyone looked at him. He seemed momentarily surprised to have drawn attention, then resigned himself to it. You should understand something about the Thermians. They were, a species of extraordinary intelligence and almost incomprehensible sincerity. They built that ship because they believed in us. Not in the characters we played. In us. He paused. Whether that faith was justified is a question I have spent several years attempting to answer. The room was quiet. Dax tilted her head, studying Dane with the expression she wore when she was reassessing someone. The prosthetics, she said. The facial ridges. Those aren't prosthetics, are they? Dane touched the side of his face almost reflexively. They are not. Thermian technology. Biological integration during our first mission. Apparently the character I portrayed was partially based on actual xenobiological data they had collected. He lowered his hand. I have since come to terms with this. Sisko stood. He moved to the viewport and looked out at the docking arm where the Protector sat, its hull catching the light of the Bajoran system with the solid, uncomplicated confidence of a ship that did not know it was supposed to be fictional. The Dominion War was 14 months old. Starfleet had lost ships at a rate that kept O'Brien up at night running supply calculations. The Jem'Hadar did not tire, did not doubt, did not stop. Every tactical advantage was precious and fleeting and paid for in crew manifests. And sitting in his docking bay was a ship that had absorbed a full Jem'Hadar salvo without flinching, crewed by 6 people from the 21st century who had learned to operate it by pretending. The Dominion will have recorded that engagement, Kira said quietly, moving to stand beside him. They'll know the Protector exists. They'll want to understand what it is. Or acquire it, Odo said. Or destroy it, Dax said. Sisko turned back to the room. Jason Nesmith was watching him with an expression that had dropped almost all of its performance now, something underneath it that was older and more serious than the smile. A man who had been here before, in rooms where decisions were being made about him and his crew, and who had learned that the best thing to do was meet it straight on. Captain Sisko, Jason said. Whatever you're thinking, we want to help. Sisko looked at him for a long moment. Mr. Nesmith, he said. I'm going to hold you to that. O'Brien had a theory about impossible things. The theory was this: the universe did not actually contain impossible things. It contained things that were possible within frameworks you didn't yet understand, and the engineer's job, the real job, underneath the conduit replacements and the plasma relay diagnostics and the 3 AM calls about replicator failures on level 5, was to find the framework. Every piece of technology he had ever encountered, from the first warp core he had serviced as a junior rating to the Cardassian systems he had spent 3 years learning to coax into cooperation aboard DS9, had eventually yielded to that principle. Find the framework. Everything makes sense inside its own logic. He had been inside the Protector's engine room for 2 hours and he was beginning to suspect this was the exception. Walk me through it again, he said, crouching beside a power conduit that pulsed with soft amber light in a rhythm that was almost biological. From the beginning. Fred Kwan lowered himself to sit cross-legged on the deck beside him with the unhurried ease of a man for whom sitting on floors was entirely natural. He was wearing his NSEA uniform still. The rust orange of whatever division he represented, engineering presumably, though O'Brien was beginning to suspect the uniform divisions on the Protector were somewhat notional. Fred looked at the conduit with the same warm, uncomplicated appreciation he had been directing at everything aboard the station. The Thermians call it quantum molecular lattice propagation, Fred said. What it basically does is treat matter and energy as the same conversation. Matter and energy are the same conversation, O'Brien said. That's E equals mc squared. That's not new. Right, but we usually talk to one side at a time. Fred touched the conduit lightly with 2 fingers, not adjusting anything, just making contact, the way someone might rest a hand on a sleeping animal. The Thermian drive system talks to both simultaneously. The reactor doesn't convert matter to energy. It asks matter what it would prefer to be, and the matter tells it, and then the ship does that. O'Brien stared at him. I know how that sounds, Fred said pleasantly. It sounds like you're describing a reactor that operates on the basis of quantum state preference algorithms, O'Brien said slowly, because saying it out loud was the only way to test whether it sounded as insane as he thought it did. Does it? That's probably more accurate than what I said. O'Brien stood up and moved to the main engineering console, which the Thermians had designed with an interface that was simultaneously intuitive and completely alien, every control exactly where you expected it to be, labeled in a script that the universal translator rendered as something close to English but with an occasional word that landed as pure sensation rather than meaning. He pulled up the reactor output readings and stared at them for a long time. The numbers were not behaving like numbers. They were behaving like suggestions. The shields, he said. When the Jem'Hadar hit you coming through the rift. A volley that size should have hurt a lot, yeah. Fred nodded. The shields don't block energy. They have a conversation with it too. They redirect it. They ask it where it really wants to go. O'Brien pinched the bridge of his nose. Fred. I have a doctorate in engineering systems from Starfleet Academy and 17 years of practical experience, and I need you to help me understand this in terms I can write in a report that Starfleet Command will take seriously. Fred considered this with genuine goodwill. The shields operate on a principle of energetic redirection through quantum state negotiation, achieving a deflection efficiency of approximately 96% against conventional directed energy weapons by interfacing with the incoming energy at the quantum level and rerouting it along the path of least universal resistance. He paused. Does that help? It helps, and it also makes me want to lie down. O'Brien turned back to the console. The Omega-13. Where is it? Fred's expression shifted slightly, not alarm exactly, but a kind of careful attention that hadn't been there before. Aft section. Behind a bulkhead that Gwen keeps locked. Why Gwen? Jason wanted to keep the key. We voted. O'Brien pulled up the sensor readings he'd taken of the Omega-13's housing from outside the bulkhead. He hadn't pushed past Gwen's very firm and entirely reasonable request that nobody touch it until they understood what had happened. The readings made his stomach do something uncomfortable. The device was small, relative to its apparent output potential, roughly the size of a photon torpedo casing, nestled in a housing that was clearly Thermian in construction but incorporating elements that matched no known material in DS9's database. Its energy signature was not stable. It was cycling, slowly, through states that the computer kept trying to classify and kept failing to, like a sensor array trying to take a photograph of something that existed in more dimensions than the camera could capture. It had punched them through dimensional space. That much was clear. What was not clear was whether it could do it again, whether doing it again would strand them further, and whether the rift it had created near the wormhole was closed, stable, or quietly getting worse. He was composing the message to Dax when his combadge chirped. Dax to O'Brien. Miles, I need you in ops. And bring your new friend. Something wrong. The rift isn't closed. O'Brien and Fred exchanged a look. How not closed? O'Brien said. It's expanding. Slowly. And something on the other side is pushing against it. In ops, the main viewscreen showed the rift as a sensor overlay, a jagged tear in space approximately 800 meters across, positioned 40 kilometers from the wormhole's standard aperture, close enough to interact with the wormhole's exotic matter field in ways that Dax was still modeling and clearly didn't like. It pulsed at irregular intervals with energies that the computer classified as dimensional variance radiation, which was a classification that meant we have no framework for this, we are doing our best. Sisko stood at the center of ops with his arms folded and the expression he wore when problems were multiplying faster than solutions. Jason Nesmith stood beside him, which was either a testament to Sisko's pragmatism or his desperation, and was studying the viewscreen with an expression that had gone very still and very serious. That's from the Omega-13, Jason said. It was not a question. The rift opened when your device activated, Dax confirmed from her console. It should have collapsed within minutes of your transit. Instead, it's been slowly expanding for the past 3 hours. At current rate, in approximately 18 hours it will be large enough to let something through, Kira finished. Something is already trying, Dax said. She brought up a secondary reading. These pressure fluctuations along the rift boundary. Something on the other side is making contact. Repeatedly. Methodically. Jason looked at the readings. Something moved across his face, recognition, and underneath it, something colder. Sarrisian's heir, he said quietly. He followed us through. Sisko turned to look at him. The fleet that attacked us, Jason said. Before the Omega-13 fired. They would have tracked the dimensional displacement. They would know where we went. He met Sisko's eyes. Captain, whoever is on the other side of that rift, they are not here for you. They're here for us. And they will go through whatever is in the way to get to the Protector. The ops center was quiet except for the soft rhythm of consoles and the distant, structural sound of a station that had been built to hold its ground. Sisko looked at the rift. He looked at Jason Nesmith. He looked at the rift again. How many ships, he said. Jason's jaw tightened. When we ran, at least 30. 30 ships. Kira had run the number through DS9's tactical database 3 times, cross-referencing the Protector's sensor logs from the engagement in the actor's home system, logs that O'Brien had spent 40 minutes learning to read because the Thermian data format organized information by emotional significance rather than chronology, which was either a profound philosophical choice or an engineering nightmare depending on how much sleep you'd had. The ships were designated in the logs by descriptors like the Angry One and the One That Feels Like Grief and the Large Vessel of Considerable Hostility, which told you a great deal about the Thermians as a species and very little about tactical specifications. What the sensor data itself told you was worse. Comparable to a Jem'Hadar heavy cruiser in terms of raw firepower, Kira said, pulling up the overlay on the tactical display. Faster than our runabouts at full impulse. Shields we don't have data on because the Protector's sensors recorded the engagement from the perspective of how frightened everyone was, which is, I'm working with what I have. She pulled up the rift readings alongside the tactical display. At current expansion rate, the rift will be transit capable in 16 hours. If they come through 30 strong, directly adjacent to the wormhole, we have a serious problem. We have a serious problem regardless, Worf said from the tactical console. He had arrived in Ops 18 minutes ago, returned from a patrol sweep in the Defiant, and had been regarding the actors with the focused suspicion of a Klingon warrior processing a threat he couldn't yet classify. He kept looking at Alexander Dane's facial ridges. He had not said anything about them, but the looking was continuous and carried considerable weight. The Dominion will have dispatched scouts to investigate the energy discharge from the rift. They detected the Protector's weapons signature in the opening engagement. They will want to understand what they are facing. Or they'll see 30 unknown ships coming through a dimensional rift adjacent to the Bajoran wormhole and assume it's a Federation weapon, Dax said. Which could provoke a response before we have time to explain. The Dominion does not ask for explanations, Worf said. No, Dax agreed. They really don't. Sisko stood at the center of it all, turning the problem slowly in his mind the way he turned baseball in his hands during difficult moments, feeling the weight of it, the seams of it, the particular physics of what was coming. He looked at Jason Nesmith, who was standing at the edge of the tactical display looking at the 30 hostile signatures with an expression that had moved well past performance into something quieter and more genuine. The man was frightened. Not the theatrical fright of someone playing a scene, the real thing, the specific fear of a person who understood the scale of what was following them and had been carrying it since the moment the Omega-13 fired. Sisko found he respected that. Pretending not to be afraid was a young officer's mistake. Knowing you were afraid and standing at the tactical display anyway was something else. We need to talk about the Protector, Sisko said. Jason looked at him. If those ships come through the rift and we're facing them with DS9's current complement, the Defiant, 2 runabouts, and whatever Starfleet can scramble from Starbase 375 in 16 hours, we lose. The math is straightforward. Sisko moved to the display. The Protector changes that math. One ship that can absorb a Jem'Hadar volley without significant shield degradation and fire at that yield, that's a force multiplier we don't have anywhere else in this sector. You want to use the Protector in combat, Jason said. I want to know if you're willing to. Jason was quiet for a moment. Behind him, visible through the ops viewport, the Protector sat in its docking arm, solid, enormous, glowing faintly with the ambient light of the Thermion reactor in a way that made it look almost alive. Almost like it was waiting. That's not just my decision, Jason said finally. He turned to look at the others. Gwen met his eyes and gave a small, precise nod that communicated a great deal in very little space. Tommy was already nodding before Jason looked at him. Fred was watching a console display with the serene attention of a man who had already made his peace with the answer. Guy Fleegman was standing with his arms crossed and his jaw set in an expression that was working very hard to be brave and not quite managing it, which was somehow more honest than bravery would have been. Alexander Dane was looking at the rift. Alexander, Jason said quietly. Dane turned. His expression was difficult to read, layered, the way an actor's face is layered when they are doing the real work, not the performance work. I didn't survive Sarris, he said, to be consumed by his legacy. He looked at Sisko. We'll fight. Sisko nodded. He turned back to Kira. Get a message to Starbase 375. Tell Admiral Ross we need whatever he can send in 16 hours, no explanation yet, just send it. He looked at Worf. The Defiant goes to yellow alert. Full weapons diagnostic. He looked at Dax. I want a continuous sensor watch on that rift. Any change in expansion rate, any change in the pressure fluctuations, I want to know immediately. There's something else, Dax said. She had the look she wore when she had been sitting on information while waiting for the right moment to introduce it, 8 lifetimes of diplomatic instinct making her careful about sequencing. While you were in the docking bay, we received a communication. Sisko looked at her. Encrypted. Romulan cipher, current generation. She brought it up. It was addressed to the NSEA Protector. The room was very quiet. Jason turned slowly to look at the message header on the display. How would the Romulans know we exist? We've been here 3 hours. The Tal Shiar has sensor assets throughout this sector, Odo said from the doorway, where he had appeared without anyone noticing, which was entirely characteristic. When something destroys a Jem'Hadar attack ship with a single shot, the Tal Shiar notices. He moved into the room with the unhurried certainty of a man who had been listening from outside for longer than was strictly necessary and had decided the time for listening was over. The message contains coordinates. A meeting point. 6 hours from now, in the Denorio's belt. A Romulan wants to meet with us, Jason said. A Romulan wants to meet with the crew of the most powerful ship they've observed in this sector since the war began, Odo said. Which means they want something. Whether that something aligns with our interests is the question. Sisko looked at Jason. Jason looked at Sisko. Between them on the display, the rift pulsed once with slow, dimensional light, and the pressure readings along its boundary spiked briefly, something on the other side, pushing. 16 hours, Sisko said quietly. 16 hours until 30 ships came through. 6 hours to decide what to do about the Romulans. And somewhere in the docking bay, behind a bulkhead that Gwen DeMarco kept locked, the Omega-13 sat in its housing, cycling through quantum states, waiting to be understood. The Dominion hit DS9 4 hours before the Romulan meeting. Not a full assault, a probe, the kind the Jem'Hadar used to test defensive configurations and response times, 3 attack ships coming in fast from the ecliptic with weapons hot and no hailing frequency because the Jem'Hadar did not negotiate approach vectors. The station's automated defense grid came up immediately, and Worf's voice cut through the comm system with the controlled urgency of a warrior who had been waiting for something to hit. The battle lasted 11 minutes. For the first 9 of those minutes, it was a standard engagement, Defiant moving to intercept, DS9's phaser arrays cycling through targeting solutions, the familiar brutal choreography of a war that had been running long enough that both sides knew each other's rhythms. The Jem'Hadar were probing the docking ring specifically, their attack pattern designed to map the station's defensive blind spots rather than inflict maximum damage, which meant they had orders to gather intelligence rather than destroy, which meant someone in the Dominion hierarchy had decided the Protector warranted a closer look. For the last 2 minutes, everything changed. Jason Nesmith had been in the Protector's bridge when the alert sounded. Not because anyone had told him to be there, but because he had spent the previous 3 hours sitting in the command chair running through the ship's systems with the focused intensity of a man cramming for an exam he had already failed once. Tommy was at the helm. Gwen was at her console, reading the computer with the quick precision she had developed over years of translating Thermian interface logic into actionable information. Fred was in engineering, which meant the reactor was doing things that O'Brien, patched in remotely, kept describing as not possible in a tone of increasing wonder. Alexander Dane was not on the bridge. Guy Fleegman was on the bridge because he had nowhere else to be, and was standing behind Tommy's station with both hands gripping the back of the chair and his knuckles at a color that suggested significant cardiovascular investment in the situation. "They're targeting the docking arm," Gwen said. "Our docking arm." "Of course they are," Jason said. He looked at the tactical display. The 3 Jem'Hadar ships were moving in a rotating pattern that kept at least one of them outside the Defiant's optimal firing arc at all times, disciplined, professional, the product of a military culture that had been engineering soldiers for centuries. "Tommy." "Yeah. Take us out." Tommy's hands moved across the helm with the quick sureness that had always been his best quality. Not thinking about it, just doing it, the muscle memory of someone who had learned to fly a Thermian starship by playing a character who could. The Protector detached from the docking arm with a deep resonant thrum and moved into DS9's engagement space. The Jem'Hadar noticed immediately. 2 of the 3 ships broke off their attack pattern and redirected toward the Protector, weapons charging. The 3rd continued its run on the station, apparently operating on the tactical logic that the unknown vessel needed to be assessed before being classified as a genuine threat. It fired on the Protector. The shields absorbed it. 96% redirection, exactly as Fred had described, the energy bloom dispersing along the ship's hull in a cascade of amber light that looked almost decorative. "Gwen," Jason said. "Forward cannons charged," she said. "Yield." Jason thought about the first shot, Tommy's miscalibrated burst that had vaporized the lead attack ship in the opening engagement. He thought about Sisko's face when he had reported 30 ships coming through the rift. He thought about what it would mean to walk into that conversation having just obliterated a Dominion probe rather than disabled it. "Minimum yield," he said. "Disable only. Minimum yield on a Thermian cannon is still. I know. Do it anyway." The Protector fired twice. Both Jem'Hadar ships lost primary power simultaneously, their weapons going dark, their engines cycling down to emergency output. They drifted. Damaged but intact. The 3rd ship, completing its run on the station, took a glancing hit from DS9's phaser array and pulled back to regroup, then, registering its 2 companions as disabled, made a calculation and went to warp. 1 ship. Running. Carrying sensor data. "They'll report back," Gwen said quietly. "Yes," Jason said. The bridge was quiet for a moment. Guy Fleegman released the back of Tommy's chair and looked at his hands with the expression of a man who had just discovered they were shaking. "I didn't die," Guy said. Softly. With genuine surprise. "No," Tommy said, not looking up from his console. "You didn't. That's the thing, right? In every story I'm in, I'm the one who," Guy stopped. He looked out at the downed Jem'Hadar ships drifting in the viewscreen. Something shifted in his face, slow and significant, like a geological process completing itself. I didn't die. Jason looked at him. For a moment the commander persona dropped entirely and it was just Jason Nesmith, an actor from Burbank who had stumbled into something real and was still figuring out what that meant, looking at a man who had spent his entire career being the cautionary example. No, Jason said. You didn't. The comm crackled. Sisko's voice, controlled, carrying the specific quality of a commanding officer who had watched someone else fight his battle and was processing complicated feelings about it. Sisko to Protector. Nicely done, Mr. Nesmith. Return to dock. On our way, Jason said. He didn't move immediately. He sat in the command chair and looked at the view screen. The drifting ships, the rift pulsing in the distance, the wormhole holding its position like a landmark in a landscape that kept changing around it. The Romulan meeting was in 2 hours. And somewhere on DS9, Alexander Dane had not been on the bridge when it mattered, and Jason didn't yet know why. Alexander Dane was in the infirmary. Not as a patient, or not entirely as a patient, which was a distinction that Dr. Julian Bashir had stopped trying to enforce approximately 40 minutes ago when it became clear that the tall, angular man with the integrated Thermian facial ridges was not going to sit on a biobed and be examined passively when there were casualties coming in from the Jem'Hadar probe and things that needed doing. The casualties were not severe by Dominion War standards. For wounded, 2 from a conduit rupture on the docking ring, 1 Bajoran security officer with a phaser burn along her left shoulder, 1 young ensign from the engineering crew who had taken a structural fragment to the leg and was being stoic about it in the way that very young officers learn to be stoic, performing competence because the real thing hadn't fully arrived yet. Bashir worked with the focused speed that the war had sharpened in him. Not frantic, never frantic, but compressed, every movement carrying the efficiency of a man who had learned to make decisions in the space between heartbeats. He registered Dane's presence at the edge of the room and had approximately 1 second to form an objection before Dane moved to the ensign's bedside, picked up a medical tricorder with the careful attention of someone learning a new instrument, and began running it along the injury with surprising competence. You know how to use that? Bashir said. I know how to look like I know how to use it, Dane said. In my experience the gap between those 2 things closes faster than you'd expect. He read the display. Microfracture. 2 centimeters proximal to the fibular head. No vascular involvement. Bashir looked at the reading over his shoulder. Accurate. Completely accurate. How? I played Dr. Lazarus for 7 years, Dane said. I researched the role with a thoroughness that my castmates found excessive and my therapist found compensatory. He set the tricorder down. The Thermians gave me actual medical texts when they built the ship. Cross-referenced with human anatomy. I have read them. A pause. Repeatedly. On long flights. There is a great deal of time on long flights. Bashir handed him an osteoregenerator without quite deciding to. Proximal fragment first. Dane took it. His hands were steady. They worked in silence for 3 minutes, Bashir on the shoulder wound, Dane on the leg fracture, the infirmary settling into the particular rhythm of a medical space doing what it was built for. The ensign looked between them with the expression of someone who had been told a confusing story and was waiting for the part that made sense. You're one of the people from the ship, the ensign said to Dane. The actors. Yes, Dane said. But you know what you're doing. Dane was quiet for a moment. The osteoregenerator hummed. I know what Dr. Lazarus would do, he said finally. I have spent a significant portion of my adult life being contemptuous of that character. His philosophy. His catchphrase. The word landed with the weight of a man setting down something heavy. It occurred to me recently that contempt is a form of attention. And attention, sustained over decades, becomes a kind of knowledge. The ensign didn't entirely follow this. Bashir did. Sisko found them there 20 minutes later, after the docking and the debrief and the message from Admiral Ross confirming 2 starships en route, the Centaur and the Magellan, neither of them fresh, both of them experienced, arriving in 14 hours. He stood in the infirmary doorway and watched Dane finish the last of the fracture repair with the quiet competence of a man who had stopped performing and started simply doing, and filed the observation away. "The Romulan meeting," Sisko said. "We need to decide." "Who goes?" Dane said. "Not a question. Who goes, and what we're willing to offer." Sisko moved into the room. Bashir took the diplomatic hint and found reasons to be on the other side of the infirmary. The Tal Shir doesn't arrange meetings out of curiosity. They want something specific. In my experience, they already know what they're willing to trade for it. They want the Protector's technology, Dane said. Or access to the Rift. Or the Omega-13. Sisko folded his arms. Or all 3. And what does Starfleet want from them? Officially? Nothing. The Federation and the Romulan Star Empire are not allies. Sisko's expression carried the particular quality of a man choosing his words inside a context that made honesty complicated. Unofficially, the Romulans have been watching the Dominion War from behind the neutral zone for 14 months. Their intelligence on Dominion fleet movements in sectors we can't access is significant. If something convinced them to share that intelligence. Something like a demonstration of technology they've never encountered, Dane said. Yes. Dane set down the osteoregenerator. He looked at Sisko with the careful attention of a man who had spent decades reading rooms professionally and had learned to distinguish between what people were saying and what they were asking. "You want Jason to go," Dane said. "Because he's convincing. Because he performs authority better than anyone on that ship, and the Romulans will read him as a commander worth negotiating with." "Yes," Sisko said. "And you want someone else to go with him who won't perform." Dane straightened. "Someone who will simply be what they are, without the theatrics, so the Tal Shir can't find the seam between the character and the person." He met Sisko's eyes. "Because if they find the seam, the negotiation ends badly." Sisko looked at him for a long moment. "Would you be willing?" Sisko said. Dane picked up his NSEA jacket from the back of the chair where he'd folded it. He looked at it, the rust and gray of a costume that had somehow become a uniform. "By Grabthar's hammer," he said quietly, and for once it didn't sound like a burden. "When do we leave?" The Romulan ship was a Valdor-class warbird, decloaked and waiting in the Denorio's belt like a predator that had decided visibility was its own kind of threat. It was enormous. The swept-forward wings, the predatory hull geometry, the faint green luminescence of its singularity drive bleeding through the ventral plating. All of it designed to communicate the same message that Romulan architecture always communicated: "We have been here longer than you, we have thought about this more carefully than you, and we are not impressed." Jason Nesmith, sitting in the Protector's forward observation seat as Tommy brought them in on approach, looked at the warbird and felt the specific sensation he always felt before a difficult scene. The moment before the cameras rolled, when everything was still possible and nothing was yet ruined. "They're hailing," Gwen said. On screen. The woman who appeared on the view screen was perhaps 50, with the precise bone structure and careful stillness of a senior Tal Shir operative, someone who had learned that expression was a resource to be managed rather than a response to be had. She wore no rank insignia. The Tal Shir rarely did. "Commander Taggart," she said. The name landed with deliberate precision. She knew it wasn't his real name and was using it anyway, which was its own message. "That's me," Jason said. Beside him, Dane said nothing. He sat with the stillness of a man who had made a professional study of stillness, his Thermian ridges catching the light, his hands folded. The Romulan's eyes moved to him once, assessed, moved back to Jason. "I am Sub-Commander Varric," she said. "I represent interests that are watching the current situation with considerable attention." "The Tal Shir," Jason said. A fractional pause. "Interested parties. The vessel you arrived in." Its technology is unlike anything in our database. Its performance in the engagement this morning was noted. I'll pass that along to our engineering team. We would like to understand it better. I imagine you would. Varric's expression didn't change, but something behind it recalibrated. She had expected either aggression or deference and had gotten neither, and the Tal Shir, Jason had learned from Gwen's briefing on the flight over, did not enjoy surprises. We are prepared to offer something of value in exchange for a technical consultation. What kind of value? Dominion fleet movements. 12 sectors. Updated within the past 72 hours. She let that sit. Including the staging area for their next offensive against the Bajoran sector. Jason kept his face neutral. Beside him he felt rather than saw Dane go very still. That's a significant offer, Jason said. We are serious people. What do you want in exchange? Access to your engineer. 20 minutes with your reactor systems. Supervised, non-invasive. Varric's eyes moved briefly to the Protector's hull on her own viewscreen. We are not asking for the technology. We are asking to understand it. Jason looked at her for a long moment. He thought about Fred, sitting cross-legged on the engine room floor having conversations with matter. He thought about what 20 minutes of Tal Shir observation of the Thermian drive system would yield for people whose entire professional identity was the acquisition and application of intelligence. No, Jason said. Varric waited. Counter-offer, Jason said. You give us the fleet movements. All 12 sectors. In exchange, I give you something more valuable than a reactor inspection. I find that unlikely. The rift that brought us here isn't closing, Jason said. In approximately 10 hours, 30 ships are coming through it. Ships you've never encountered, with weapons and drive technology that will make your sensor operators very nervous. They're not coming for the Federation. They're coming for us. He leaned forward slightly. When they arrive, you're going to want to know exactly what they are and exactly what they can do. I can give you that intelligence. Full technical specifications on the Sarrisians. Their ships, their weapons, their tactical doctrine. Everything the Thermians compiled over years of conflict. He paused. That's worth more to the Tal Shir than 20 minutes looking at an engine you won't understand anyway. The observation room was very quiet. Varric studied him. The study was thorough and professional and lasted exactly long enough to communicate that she was not rushing. The Thermians, she said. The species that built your vessel. Yes. They compiled this intelligence. They compiled everything. It's what they did. Jason kept his voice even. They were observers. Documentarians. They watched and they recorded and they built the most comprehensive database on Sarrisian military capability that exists anywhere. He didn't add, and then Sarris killed most of them. The grief was there in his voice anyway, quiet and real, and Varric heard it. He could tell she heard it because something in her expression shifted by one precise degree. Dane spoke for the first time. The intelligence is genuine, he said. His voice carried the weight of a man making a statement he would stake his reputation on. And complete. Varric looked at him. Whatever she saw in Dane's face, the absence of performance, the simple factual quality of a man who had stopped pretending, settled something in her assessment. The fleet movements for the technical files, she said. Agreed, Jason said. The data transfer took 4 minutes. Gwen confirmed the Dominion intelligence was genuine against DS9's known reference points. 7 of 12 sectors matched existing Starfleet data exactly, which meant the remaining 5 were new. As the Protector broke from the warbird and turned back toward DS9, Dane looked at Jason with an expression that was almost something like warmth. You didn't offer them the reactor, Dane said. Fred would never forgive me, Jason said. No, Dane agreed. He wouldn't. Behind them, the warbird cloaked and vanished into the belt. And on DS9 sensors, the rift pulsed, wider now, the pressure along its boundary building towards something that wasn't going to wait much longer. The rift tore open 6 hours early. No warning. No gradual escalation of the pressure readings. One moment it was a contained dimensional scar pulsing at predictable intervals, and the next it was a wound in space 3 kilometers across, pouring hard radiation and dimensional variance energy across 40,000 cubic kilometers of Bajoran sector, and through it came the Sarrisian fleet like something that had been waiting a long time to be angry. 31 ships. One more than the count Jason had given, a flagship, larger than the others, its hull bearing the asymmetric scarring of a vessel that had been rebuilt around its weapons systems multiple times until the weapons were the ship and everything else was incidental. Worf's voice on the station-wide channel, all hands to battle stations. This is not a drill. DS9's weapon pylons came up simultaneously. The Defiant launched from the upper docking port at full impulse, Worf pushing her hard into an intercept vector. The Centaur and Magellan, arrived 2 hours ago, crews exhausted from emergency warp, fell into formation off DS9's flanks with the practice coordination of ships that had been fighting together long enough to think collectively. It wasn't enough. The numbers were honest about that. The Sarrisian flagship led the first wave directly toward DS9, ignoring the Defiant entirely. A statement of priorities that made Kira's jaw tighten at the tactical console. They weren't here to conquer the station. They were here to burn through it to get to the Protector docked behind it. Protector, this is Cisco. His voice on the comm was controlled, stripped of everything except information. We need you outside. Now. Already moving, Jason said. The Protector undocked with a thrum that O'Brien, watching from the docking bay controls, felt in his back teeth. It cleared the docking arm and came around DS9's primary hull in a banking turn that Tommy executed with the smooth certainty of someone who had stopped thinking about flying and simply flown, and it opened fire before it had finished the turn. Not minimum yield this time. The first Sarrisian ship in the lead formation ceased to exist. The second lost its forward section. The third took a glancing hit that sent it spinning out of the attack vector, trailing atmosphere and debris. The Sarrisian formation fractured, ships breaking pattern to reassess the threat, and in that 3-second window of fractured momentum the Defiant and the Centaur hit them from opposing vectors and the DS9 weapon pylons opened up with everything they had. 11 Sarrisian ships down in the first 90 seconds. Then the flagship fired. The beam that came from the Sarrisian flagship was not a weapon Jason recognized from the Thermian files. It was something new, something built specifically, O'Brien would later determine, to defeat Thermian shielding. It hit the Protector amidships and the shields held but barely, the deflection efficiency dropping from 96% to 61% in a single hit, and the ship shuddered in a way that sent everyone on the bridge to the floor. Shields at 60%, Gwen said from the floor, pulling herself back to her console. That weapon is modulated against us. It knows our shield frequency. How? Tommy said. Sarris, Jason said. He was already back in the command chair. His heir had years to study the Thermian technology. He built something specifically to punch through it. He looked at the flagship on the view screen, patient, enormous, repositioning for a second shot. Gwen, can we modulate? Give me 90 seconds. We don't have 90 seconds. The flagship fired again. The Protector rolled on Tommy's instinct alone, the beam catching the port engine housing instead of the primary hull, significant damage, one of the amber reactor lights on the engineering display going red, but the ship held. Fred's voice from engineering, utterly calm, the port housing is asking what we'd prefer it to be. I'm having a conversation with it. Fred, Jason started. 30 seconds. On DS9, Cisco watched the engagement with the focused attention of a commander calculating variables. The Protector was absorbing punishment that would have destroyed the Defiant twice over, but the flagship's modulated weapon was a problem that was going to solve itself in the Sarrisians' favor if nothing changed. He looked at the rift, still open, still pouring dimensional radiation, 3 more Sarrisian ships holding position at its edge as reserves. "Kira," he said. "The rift." She looked at him. "If we collapse it with the station's deflector array, the reserve ships can't reinforce. And whatever is left of the Sarrisian fleet can't retreat. It'll take everything the deflector has. We'll be without shields for 11 minutes. "I know." Kira looked at him for 1 second, the look of a Bajoran resistance fighter who had learned a long time ago that the right call and the safe call were rarely the same call. Then she turned to her console and started the deflector realignment sequence. On the Protector's bridge, Guy Fleegman had been at the secondary tactical console for 6 minutes. Nobody had told him to be there. He had simply sat down when the shooting started and started working the targeting system with the careful attention of a man who had watched Jason and Tommy and Gwen do their jobs for years and had paid more attention than anyone knew. He fired on the flagship's weapon emitter. Not the ship. Not a killing blow. The weapon emitter specifically, a precise, minimum yield shot that hit the modulation housing on the flagship's primary cannon and destroyed it cleanly. The flagship went to secondary weapons. Standard yield. The Protector's shields, remodulated in the 30 seconds Fred had asked for, absorbed the hit at 94%. "That was me," Guy said. To no one in particular. With quiet, complete astonishment. "That was me." DS9's deflector array fired. The rift collapsed like a wound finally closing, a shockwave of dimensional energy rolling outward and catching the 3 reserve ships at its edge, knocking them dark. The remaining Sarrisian ships, 12 of 31 still combat capable, found themselves cut off, outnumbered, and facing a vessel their flagship could no longer hurt. They stopped firing. The silence after a battle had a specific texture. Not peaceful. Peace was something you built deliberately, over time, with intention. This was different. This was the silence of systems still hot, of damage control teams moving through smoke-hazed corridors, of medical staff doing the arithmetic of who needed what and in what order. It was the silence of people who had been inside something terrible coming back to themselves one breath at a time. DS9 held it for approximately 4 minutes before the work began. The 12 remaining Sarrisian ships had powered down weapons and were holding position 40,000 kilometers out, their communications cycling through frequencies in what the universal translator was slowly, laboriously beginning to parse as distress signals rather than tactical chatter. The flagship was dark except for emergency lighting. Guy's shot on the weapon emitter had cascaded into the primary power distribution network in ways that the Thermian file suggested was a known vulnerability, which meant Guy had either gotten very lucky or had absorbed more technical knowledge sitting in the back of briefings than anyone had given him credit for. Possibly both. Sisko took the Sarrisian surrender personally. He stood at the communications console in ops with Dax beside him and navigated 40 minutes of translation difficulty and cultural misunderstanding and 1 moment of genuine alarm when the Sarrisian commander's concept of surrender turned out to involve a ritual exchange of command codes that DS9's computer spent 8 minutes pretending to understand, and at the end of it, the 12 ships agreed to hold position pending negotiation and the flagship agreed to accept a medical team. Jason Nesmith requested permission to be on that team. Sisko granted it, which surprised Kira until she thought about it for a moment and then it didn't. The Sarrisians had come here for Jason. Whatever the negotiation became, he was the variable at its center. Better to put him in the room deliberately than have him arrive anyway. The Sarrisian flagship's commander was not what Jason had expected. She was young, younger than him, younger than anyone he would have assigned to a flagship. With the angular features of her species and the specific exhaustion of someone who had been carrying a mission for too long without believing in it fully. Her name translated approximately as Vesh. She had inherited the grudge against the Protector from Sarris's heir, who had inherited it from Sarris, which meant she was the 3rd generation of a vendetta that had started before she was born. She looked at Jason across the width of the flagship's damaged bridge and said, through the translator, something that took 3 attempts to render accurately. "You are the one they made the stories about. Yes, Jason said. The stories were not real. No. They weren't. She was quiet for a moment. Around her, her crew worked damage control with the focused efficiency of people who had no other option. Sarris believed they were real. His heir believed they were real. We followed a war across dimensional space for a fiction. I know, Jason said. And he did know. Had known for years, had carried it the way you carry something that you caused without meaning to, that cannot be uncaused. I'm sorry. Vesh looked at him with an expression the translator couldn't parse. Then she looked around at her damaged ship, her exhausted crew, the darkness where the weapon emitter had been. What happens now? Jason looked at Sisko, who was standing to one side with the attentiveness of a man who had decided this was not his conversation to lead. Sisko gave him nothing back, no guidance, no signal, just the patient attention of a commander who had decided to trust someone and was holding to that decision. Now, Jason said, we figure out if there's something better than this. The Omega-13 sat in its housing in the aft section of the Protector, and Gwen unlocked the bulkhead for the first time since they'd arrived. She and O'Brien stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. It pulsed with its quiet, dimensional light, cycling through states that the computer couldn't classify, waiting with the patience of an object that did not experience time the way its users did. It can send you home, O'Brien said. Not a question. We think so, Gwen said. If we can tune it to the dimensional coordinates of our own universe rather than just firing it and hoping. I can help with the tuning, O'Brien said. Given 2 or 3 days. Gwen looked at him. You do that. You saved this station, O'Brien said simply. And you brought me the most interesting engineering problem I've encountered in 17 years of service. Yes, I'd do that. Gwen looked at the Omega-13 for a moment. Miles. If we go home, the Sarrisian ships. The Dominion intelligence from the Romulans. The rift closure. Does any of it stay? All of it stays, O'Brien said. You were here. What you did was real. That doesn't go anywhere. She nodded slowly. The Omega-13 pulsed once, amber and soft. They left on the 3rd day. The docking bay was not crowded, Sisko had kept the departure quiet, which felt right. Kira was there. Dax. O'Brien, who shook Fred's hand for a very long time and said something quietly that made Fred smile his uncomplicated smile. Worf was there, and in the end he walked directly to Alexander Dane and looked at the Thermian ridges and said, with complete sincerity, You fought well, son of no house. You have earned a house of your own. Dane stood very straight. Something crossed his face that he didn't try to manage or perform or contain. By Grabthar's hammer, he said quietly. By the sons of Warvan. You shall be avenged. And for the first time in years, it sounded exactly like what it always should have been, not a burden, not a joke, not a catchphrase recycled past meaning. It sounded like a promise. It sounded like something a person could build a life around if they chose to. Sisko shook Jason's hand on the boarding ramp. You have good people, Sisko said. I know, Jason said. I always knew. I just kept forgetting. The Protector's engines came up with their deep Thermian resonance, and the Omega-13 fired, and the dimensional rift opened clean and precise, nothing like the ragged tear that had brought them here, this one deliberate, calibrated, the difference between a wound and a door. The NSEA Protector went through it and was gone. In the silence that followed, DS9 held its position at the edge of the Bajoran system, carrying its scars and its intelligence files and its memory of 6 people who had arrived by accident and stayed on purpose. The Dominion War was not over. The hard mathematics of it remained exactly as brutal as they had always been. But Starfleet had fleet movements for 12 sectors. The Romulans had a reason to keep watching. The Sarrisian ships were beginning, slowly, to talk about something other than vengeance. And somewhere in the station's records, filed under anomalous contacts with a star date and a set of sensor logs that would generate a great deal of confusion at Starfleet Command, was the testament to what 6 people who had only ever pretended to be heroes discovered when the pretending ran out. They had been the real thing all along. They just needed a war to show them. The Federation's record of the NSEA Protector's 3-day presence in the Bajoran sector remained classified for 11 years, not because of what the crew had done, but because of what their existence implied. That belief, sustained with enough sincerity, could build something real. Starfleet wasn't sure what to do with that. The Vulcan Science Academy filed it under theoretical philosophy and declined to comment. The Bajoran people, when the record was eventually declassified, added a small entry to the texts of the prophets. It read simply, "They came from a story and became themselves." That was considered sufficient. If you want to see more characters collide with the Star Trek universe, hit that subscribe button and drop a name in the comments. Who should enter the Trek universe next? Live long and prosper. More stories await.